we have a scholar from the United States. We want to welcome him, Dr. Eric McDuffie. After the seminar, you might want to have a little chat with him. He's looking forward to that. Thanks, Your Eminence. Welcome. Well, I know something gone. Thank you very much. Brian. The chair of the proceedings, I will not be long at all, but I just want to welcome you as head of department. And the chair of today's proceedings is Dr. Michael Toussaint. I think everyone here knows Dr. Toussaint. So without any further ado, I will hand over the proceedings to Dr. Toussaint.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And by that I am speaking to all the professional academics in our company at this moment, and all those students who have, with due diligence and commitment, made your presence here to be part of this seminar on Marcus Garvey. It is now approximately 100 years since Marcus Garvey formed the UNIA, and some almost 75 years since his passing. As we all know, he's an important Caribbean figure. He's an important figure, African descended figure in the Americas, and he's an important figure in the world for his thinking, for his vision, for his influence. And therefore, as we commemorate our inaugural History Fest, this is the first of what will be, or promises to be, many years of fruitful academic discussion and collaboration and dialogue. And as we experience this inaugural session, Marcus Garvey is a fitting subject for our contemplation. I welcome you on behalf of the Department of History. I welcome those of you who are strangers to our lands, not absolutely strange. Dr. McDuffie has been here before, but I welcome all of you on behalf of the department, again, following on the head of the department, and on behalf of the university. Let us begin. Our first speaker, who is going to communicate with us on race consciousness versus class solidarity, the impact of Marcus Garvey on the labor movement in Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Jerome Teelucksingh. Each speaker will have approximately 20 minutes. Professor McDuffie is going to have a bit more time for his thoughts. Approximately 20 minutes, and we will decide as we proceed whether we will take questions immediately or the questions are going to come afterwards. So let's go.
Lecturers, students, other friends, thank you for being here today. I want to discuss Marcus Garvey and his impact on the labor movement in Trinidad and Tobago in the early 20th century. My sources for this paper included documents from West Indiana, the National Archives in Port of Spain, Public Records in Office in London, and books by scholars such as Tony Martin. I've also used two local newspapers, The People and The Labor Leader, which are the best primary sources available on this subject regarding the relationship between the Trinidad Working Men's Association, a local labor movement headed by Captain Arthur Cipriani, and Garveysism. Let me firstly indicate some of the salient points in Garveys' philosophy which motivate him, which he shared with the African diaspora, and which inspired the working class in Trinidad and Tobago. Garvey envisioned the establishment of a universal fraternity among Africans to promote the spirit of a proud African nation. He also wanted to awaken the sense of self-esteem among Africans and the need to reclaim the fallen of the race. He wanted to rekindle a sense of national pride in the African states. He also wanted to dispel and dispute the colonial perception of the ignorance and political immaturity of Africans and their apparent unpreparedness for independence and self-governance. Garveys said, and I quote, "We have had an education of 500 years that ought to teach us how to live, how to govern, how to rule. I cannot see how Negroes can be satisfied to have other people lead them," end of quote. Garvey was convinced that Africans had the capacity and intelligence to achieve economic independence. He felt that being successful in commerce and industry was necessary if political power was to become a reality for the Africans. Garvey's advocacy for the mobilization of Africans served as an inspiration for many branches of the Trinidad Working Men's Association whilst they organized the working class here in this country. How did Garvey impact on the labor movement in Trinidad and Tobago? Firstly, he justified their defiance against colonialism and imperialism. Garvey provided a philosophical foundation for the working class here. He inspired the oppressed African working class of the need to uplift themselves. Garvey provided a challenge for the Africans in the colony to take their destiny into their own hands. He showed them that economic prosperity was possible. Marcus Garvey also displayed that determination and unity was necessary if they wanted economic and political independence. So Garvey inspired the membership of the Trinidad Working Men's Association, who were mostly of African descent, to view themselves as part of a global movement of oppressed peoples throughout the world. Garveyism was personalized in a movement known as the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. It had branches throughout the world. Their publication, the Negro World, was also published in other languages besides English. And in Trinidad, in 1926, Tony Martin identified almost 30 Garveyite groups functioning and operating successfully in this colony at that time. Branches were established in rural and urban areas: Chaguanas, Hoover, Pinal, San Fernando, Port of Spain. And these members also operated within UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. They were members of the Black Cross nurses, the juveniles. So the TWA played a dual role. Members served a dual role. They belonged to Garvey's group and they belonged to the TWA. For example, William Howard Bishop was the president of the main UNIA branch in Port of Spain and also editor of the Labor Leader and General Secretary of the TWA. James Braffett served as president of the Port of Spain UNIA branch. He also was the TWA secretary. How did the colonial authorities respond to Garveyism? Obviously, they were very concerned about this philosophy, this ideology which challenged colonialism, which challenged imperialism. And in February 1919, authorities discovered UNIA agents in Trinidad selling copies of Garvey's publication, The Negro World. Howard Bishop was allegedly the person who brought these copies quietly into Trinidad and circulated among TWA branches. Government officials also believed that the message of race consciousness in the Negro World was influential in the outbreak of the December 1919 longshoremen strike in Port of Spain. In an effort to ban the importation of publications from the United States that would, and I quote, excite racial hatred, the Trinidad government passed an ordinance in April 1920, and the Legislative Council agreed that this amendment, this legislation was supposedly important to ban the Negro World from Trinidad and Tobago. So the Negro World was seen as a subversive document, something that was stirring up the masses. So it was no surprise that after the December 1919 strike in Port of Spain, some of the leaders of that strike in Port of Spain were deported. Among the deportees included Reverend Salmon, who was Assistant Secretary of the TWA, he was deported to Jamaica. Brutus Ironman deported to British Guyana, which is today Guyana. And Bruce Maconey deported to Barbados. This close relationship between the TWA and Garveys UNIA branches in Trinidad was difficult for the colonial authorities to suppress or dissolve. The labor leader, TWA's publication gave extensive coverage of the jailing of Garvey after his arrest in January 1922 for mail fraud. Garvey blamed his predicament on the jealousy amongst Africans for his being jailed in 1922. Throughout his trial and whilst he was in jail, the labor leader had columns in its publication informing the membership of the innocence of Garvey and biased reporting. Where was the biased reporting coming from? There were two local publications, the Trinidad Guardian, which still exists today, and the Port of Spain Gazette, which is no longer around. And these two newspapers were, of course, elitists. They belonged to the elites, and they felt that Garvey was guilty. They were trying to show that the role model, the hero, the messiah amongst Africans was guilty of this mail fraud. And the labor leader was trying to show that Garvey was a victim, that Garvey was not really guilty of this crime. The UNIA Division number 26 in Port of Spain actually sent a petition with names to the US authorities pleading for Garvey's release and pleading for Garvey's innocence. The jailing of Garvey was of great concern to the working class in Trinidad and Tobago. The black working class saw their hero being jailed. He had inspired them, he gave them an ideology, he made them confident, and they always had faith in him. They expressed solidarity with him. And strangely enough, but not surprisingly, the Trinidad Guardian selected articles from the US publications to republish, to reprint in their newspapers, to try to humiliate the working class, to try to humiliate the African working class, to say, this is how your hero is, this is how guilty your hero is, he's a common thief. Garvey had planned to visit Trinidad in 1927, but this did not materialize. The Trinidad Guardian was only too willing to publish views which opposed Garvey's visit. However, in October 1937, Garvey finally arrived in Trinidad as part of his British West Indian tour. However, the colonial authorities had imposed restrictions on Garvey during his 2-day visit to the colony. He was banned from open-air meetings, and he could not make any political statements at these indoor meetings. So you see what they did, they allowed Garvey in the colony, but they had him on a leash, and they were monitoring him. They had the police there within the crowds taking notes. Why were these restrictions on Garvey in 1937? Garvey was always regarded with suspicion by colonial authorities. He was a radical revolutionary. The governor and others were always uneasy with his presence during these 2 days. And some of these authorities feared that the June 1937 riots in Trinidad was a result of Garvey's influence. And this was very true, because what happened in October 1937, Governor Murchison Fletcher expressed fears that Garveyism had inspired the June 1937 riots. And in fact, I found correspondence in which Murchison Fletcher, the governor of Trinidad and Tobago, wrote to Sir Mark Young, the governor of Barbados, in August 1937, and Fletcher wrote, I quote, "I heard Garvey's name for the first time at the beginning of our industrial unrest here," end of quote. And what I have realized is that the Garveyites and Butlerites shared a similar ideology. In fact, Garveyism influenced Butler. And Butler is a great orator, he was very charismatic, very dynamic, and he also saw Butler. He also saw Marcus Garvey as one of his heroes, one of his role models. So we see this close relationship between not just the TWA, But the Butler movement that was emerging during the 1930s, there was a very close relationship between these two ideologies, these two movements, the Garvey movement and the Butler movement. Garvey's speeches in 1937, whilst he was in Trinidad, was motivational and inspirational, but his message lacked the emphasis on Africa for the Africans and the need to return to the fatherland. Instead, Garvey's speeches concentrated on the power of the mind, and indirectly he sought to motivate the African working class. Now, not all Afro-Trinidadians found Garveys' ideology appealing, or they welcomed him with open arms. Two of his biggest critics were C.L.R. James and George Padmore, both members of the International African Service Bureau. And these two men were at Hyde Park in London, and they heckled Garvey, just as we have Woodford Square, where Port-au-Prince people could speak and debate. They had a Hyde Park in London, and it still exists, where they could debate. And they heckled Garvey because Garvey condemned the action of the Trinidad strikers in June 1937. But Garvey blamed the June 37 protest, the strike, on the International African Service Bureau, which he called communistic, and felt it had a political agenda. So we see this ideological break. It could be a jealousy between C.L.R. James and Padmore versus Garvey, right? So yes, they were pro-Africa, they were pro-black, but they had their differences. What I've also found in the research, which is very interesting, many of the Indo-Trinidadians during the 1920s and 1930s did not fully identify with Garveyism. They did not fully embrace Garveyism. They found it better to associate with the TWA, but not with Garveyism. Why did they not want to associate with Garveyism? Some felt it was too Afrocentric, and the Indians were already had a race consciousness in them. Many belonged to organizations as the East India National Association and the East India National Congress. So they already, the Indo-Trinidadians, the Indians in the colony, had an ethnic identity. They already had their identity, their race consciousness, so they did not see the need to embrace Garveyism. Yes, some would have gone to hear Garvey's speeches in 1937, some would have read the columns in the Labor Leader, some would have read the Negro World, but they did not see the need to embrace Garveyism. What was happening to the Indians during the 1920s and 30s was that they were of different linguistic, cultural, religious, and ethnic identities. There was a certain racial separation occurring. Indians on the sugar estate, some belonged to the TWA, some didn't feel the need to belong to a working class organization, yet they were being influenced by the TWA and by Captain Cipriani. Some scholars believe Garveyism might have contributed to the polarization of the two major races at that time, right? But that is very debatable. Some people have examined Garvey's race consciousness, and they have felt it like they've been too explicit, too intense, too assertive, right? It's difficult for us to determine that, but from where I stand, I believe that Garveyism was very important to undermine colonialism, to undermine imperialism, and to put forth one of the strongest challenges in the first half of the 20th century to colonialism. And the way I see Garvey is that Garvey was one of the architects who helped liberate the Caribbean. Garvey was one of the people who helped give us independence. He stood up not just a race consciousness, but he helped people to understand that we were rational, we were logic, we were intelligent enough to receive independence, to demand independence from the British, right? I want to thank you all.